What a
Are you?
moving intro, Joseph.
I mean, you can intro it however you
Wait,
want,
hold
man.
on. Are we recording now?
I can cut whatever you don't want to be the intro and just start it at the intro.
Okay.
The
Hey
magic of
guys!
Let's
movie
not
making!
have.
Well, hi everybody. Welcome to Nature Chat, the chat after Nature Check. I'm here with Peter and Joe again this evening, except that we're switching roles, and Joe is going to be the interviewee of sorts, I guess. But first, a quick recap of what happened during episode 6 of Nature Check. So our heroes had done a whole bunch of investigating, looking for physical evidence and also just straight up information to try to solve the mystery of the murder of Timothy Prendergast, or at the very least solve enough of the murder to exonerate Jay Prowell, Kay's older brother. They were able to have a conversation with Sawan, a mysterious girl who showed up in Hudson Green's office, and they had a conversation with her about them working off Hudson's debt to Sawan, and in exchange, she permitted Janet Green to provide testimony and an alibi for Jay Prowell. So they went through the trial, and the judge was convinced of Jay's innocence, and everything is happy. And then there was a lot of just like random shenanigans for a while. So that's what happened in Nature Check. Looks like the crew might be ready to head out of New Sachester and start exploring the beautiful, wide open space of Arda, which I have totally finished developing for them to explore. So I guess that's what will happen in episode number 7. Thoughts on the murder mystery arc?
Oh, I loved it.
Oh,
Thought it was a blast.
yeah, it was a total surprise.
Why was it a total
Well,
surprise?
I was not there for part of it, so I kind of had to catch up. But yeah, I think the sort of plot twist at the end, where we're kind of now indentured, is a thing, and I think that Lucanus's reaction to this is going to be kind of interesting because we've already seen how seriously he takes it. Yeah, there's reasons for him not taking it that seriously,
Mm-hmm.
but well, I'm sure that we're gonna explore those.
Yeah. I think
So
just to me, we had, this very concrete idea of, all right, we're going to go investigate this whole fish mystery. And then I've never experienced just kind of this complete 180 of, oh, we have this emergency that we have to deal with. And we have to, our plans are completely disrupted, which is, it's very real life. Um,
yeah,
and so this thing cropped up. We have to deal with it, right away, which we did. Yeah.
it always happens during field work. So
Well, and we legitimately were planning on going out and doing field work, right? We were going to go figure out what
yeah,
was wrong with these fish and collect some samples and bring them back and investigate this. And
And as he was
real
busy
life gets in the way.
Yeah,
Yeah.
as he was busy sending Kay cryptic messages. Don't go out there yet. I need you to stay here.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, no, I thought you guys did a great job of sort of investigating all of the angles that you wanted to figure out. Well, how do we get an alibi to protect him, and how do we, find physical evidence in the alleyway to make sure that it wasn't him? And I think you did a great job of. You may not have solved the murder and figured out who actually done it, but you did do a good job of convincing the judge that Jay was not the murderer. So.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, I don't know about Lucanus, but I know that Cedric really struggles with this whole, since the beginning of the campaign, this whole like not quite just justice system in New Chapter. So, I mean, that's something that he's kind of coming to terms with and going to continue to wrestle with. I mean, Lucanus's background with kind of the rule of law and order, I feel like is very still very mysterious. Joe, do you want to? I don't know if you want to reveal anything about
Well,
that. Or...
um, so from what we know of Lucanus's backstory, he had a rough childhood because he lived through a sort of dissolution of his society. So he goes to he goes to a place where there's actual like guards and courts and not roving bands of mercenaries. Um, I think that um, honestly, I don't think that he's gonna take the justice system very seriously at first because he just hasn't been exposed to it. Like his version of the justice system is somebody robs your house, so you just go and kill them. Like like he he sees the guards and he sort of knows how it works, and he's like, cool, but I'm still gonna solve problems myself.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah,
sort of.
whereas Cedric, I mean, I feel like has that implicit trust in the judicial
Yeah.
system. Yeah, so it's kind of the opposite, right? Where he's having to come to terms with the fact
Yeah,
that
and I
he's
think to
not.
Lucanus, it's more just a thing that exists. That like he's like, well, it doesn't affect me yet, so I'll figure it out when it does.
Well, and it's interesting to think about how disparate your characters' backgrounds are when it comes to thinking about the rule of law, right? Like Lucanus said, he was growing up or having a lot of his formative experiences at a time where there was complete lawlessness in his area of the world. But Cedric has grown up in this very sort of strict and structured society in like a well-established city in on his continent, and now you're in New Seychester, which is sort of in this hand wavy Wild West style town out in the middle of nowhere that doesn't really belong to anyone, but like the law system and the town guard and the military stationed in the fort all belong to Tenebria, but it's not. It's like a lot of things happening in North America and the British colonies, right? You're so far away from your homeland that a lot of things sort of are weird, but also this idea that like the justice system has to be a little loosey-goosey because like there are a lot of people in this town who are not Tenebrian citizens, and so you can't exactly deal with everything the same way you would on the home turf of Tenebria. So yeah, this is very much like Wild West rule of law in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And I think one other interesting thing, about my character is that we can see him kind of sort of opening up and getting more comfortable around the other characters and showing like genuine affection. And I think that it's starting to like become, we sort of had an exchange where Cedric was like, "I'm the only one who's paid you," and it's like that's not why he's really stuck around. So I thought that was a really like, even though it was sort of a joking exchange, like I thought it was a really informative one, at least from a character development standpoint.
Well, and I'm so touched by the sort of like Big Brother thing that you've been doing for Kay. Not creepy Big Brother, but like caring Big Brother, right? That like, I mean, yeah, she's got a whole bunch of siblings, but you're sort of being yet another adopted sibling that like, oh, you're there for her when she needs to cry, and you're there to help protect her, and like, I think that's really sweet.
Yeah. Yeah, Kay's character seems to pick up family pretty quickly.
that's a thing about the Prowl family. The more you get to know the Prowls, the more you'll understand.
Yeah. No, and I like that about the character. I think it's good, and it's one of those things where my character has a lot of sort of defenses, and he's starting to let them down a bit. So I think that it'll be interesting to see how he develops from here on out. So.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So Joe, all right, we know where Lucanus is from. Where are you from?
I am originally from Iowa. I grew up in a town called Ankeny, which is about halfway between Des Moines and Ames. Ames is where Iowa State University is, and that's where I got my bachelor's degree. And then from there, I went down to University of Georgia, and that's where I got my master's degree, and that's where Nancy and I met. And we've been working on a lot of outreach stuff since then. And I spent the last few years. What?
Sorry, no. Go ahead.
Oh, I've also spent the last few years kind of bouncing around the South. I've worked for the USDA, worked for industry, and now I am studying weeds out west with a professor that, so it's sort of we've sort of remarked in private, I don't know how much in public, that it's sort of a weird thing that I switched sort of from entomology to weed science, but in this case I really decided to choose the advisor rather than the model.
Yeah, we can discuss your treasonous.
Oh.
Dude, I'm still an invertebrate biologist.
We did have a whole
Um,
discussion about plants being invertebrates. But I think that's
yeah,
a really important point you just made about choosing the advisor rather than the program or the
Yeah.
organism. That is the number one best thing you can do for yourself if you're considering grad
Yeah.
school is to think about the person who's going to be your boss and your coworker for the next
Yeah.
however many years because they will make or break whether or not you succeed basically in that program.
Yeah, and Andrew,
absolutely.
the reason why I chose him is because he does a lot of outreach, just like me, and a lot of the outreach he does is on very controversial topics. Again, a lot like me. So, based on this interest, I felt like his lab would be a good environment, and that's certainly turned out to be true. So,
Nice.
Okay, so speaking of outreach, so when you were still in Georgia, I mean, you and Nancy met each other, and you guys decided to create Ask an Entomologist. Can you talk a
yep.
little bit about that and what was the impetus behind that? You were just grad students. Why would you do something so bold and so outrageous?
Well, yeah, it's turned out to be very bold, and we can talk about that more when we meet up in November. So the reason why I wanted to start asking entomologists was because I wanted to have a way for people to interact with the scientific community, and a lot of my outreach since then had been one-way communication. So we essentially put words out into the ether, hope people will listen, and I wanted to see if we could figure out a way to make it more of a dialogue. And
So
that
to interrupt, so you're talking about like you would write a blog post and you would hope that people would read it or something like that.
Yeah,
So,
that's exactly what it is.
okay.
Just sort of talking at people, and I wanted to see if we could do something talking to people um, through the internet, and that turned out to be extremely successful, far more than we could have ever dreamed. Because uh, we started out getting, maybe one or two emails a month, and we could write a blog post about like every email, and then like it got to 20 or 30 emails a month, and now it's like hundreds. And
Wow.
yeah, it's
So lots of
it's
people
been an
have bug
experience.
questions.
Yeah, well, I mean, a lot of people are so I a lot of those people are just looking for help for infestations, which we don't really do. We pawn them off on the National Pesticide Information Center because they can get, the urban IPM people
Mhm.
like Jody and Jonathan to help with those problems more. I mean, let's face it, in a more legally protected way than I could. Um, so another big chunk of the questions that we get are, people who think that they're infested with parasites, but they really aren't. It's a pretty common illness that entomologists deal with, and there's not really a way to deal with it that makes everybody feel good in the end.
Mhm.
Because a lot of it's just it's so hard to track because people just keep doctor shopping all across the country, and yeah. But there are also a lot of really good questions. We are currently tabulating them, and we're going to try to put out a study. Again, this is sort of a very, very niche side project, so um, we're going to. It's been going slower than we want, so I'm going to be talking to Nancy and Joni at ESA in November about ways to speed it up. So a surprising amount of the questions that we get asked, I'd say maybe 5 to 10%, at least as far as I can tell, do not have answers. People haven't looked into them.
Wow.
Wow.
Um, and again, that's just a sort of off my head gut feeling type figure. We're going to have to do some better
Sure.
quantification of that, or at least I feel like we should. But a lot of the questions that we get are very surprisingly complex. People are certainly watching insects, and
Hmm.
they certainly sort of wonder about what they're observing.
Hmm.
And it also is really interesting to me that, if you do a histogram of all of our submissions, most of the submissions come in during the summer,
Mm-hmm.
and most of the readership on our blog happens during the summer. So, yeah. Uh, so it's been a pretty wild ride, and honestly, we get too many questions to even respond to at this point, and we're not really sure what to do about that. Or at least, let me rephrase that. I'm not very sure about what to do about that. I've spoken to Joni a little bit about it, and we're going to have to figure out essentially what to do. 'Cause,
So,
yeah.
yeah. So sorry. So to interject, the Joni is the third member of Asking.
Yeah, so
Third
there's three of
host.
us who work on it. I really should have explained this better. There's three of us who work on it. Nancy Miorelli, Joan, myself, and Jim King. And Nancy and I started this I would say maybe 2 years out of my master's. It wasn't it was after I left the USDA. And Joni came on about 2 years after, and we very quickly decided to, do a study on the questions that we have.
So is Joni a friend of y'all's from Georgia, or?
So I think Joni started essentially the semester after I graduated and left. So she and I did not overlap at UGA, but she and Nancy were very close at UGA.
So you're all Georgia graduates.
We are all University of Georgia graduates.
Nice.
Okay,
Some
so
of the
y'all
best
heard
outreach
it.
comes from there.
Y'all heard it here first. Ask an Entomologist has a very southern bias
Apparently.
in their answers. So if you're asking for Pacific Northwest, pest ID questions.
Or from anywhere that's not North America or Ecuador.
Yeah.
Well, so here's the thing. You can say that we're sort of southern biased, but I'm from the Midwest. Joni's from the Northeast. Or sorry, Nancy's from the Northeast. She's from Connecticut. Joni is from Florida, which is, as I understand, I don't remember exactly where she's from, but I think she's from South Florida, and if that's the case, South Florida is basically the North.
Yes. As a North Carolinian, I completely agree. South Florida is actually technically it's a part of New York.
Oh my god.
Which is broken off and then gotten attached down onto the
Have you asked New Yorkers for their opinion on that?
All the New Yorkers that matter, which is one or two, have agreed with me on this. So
yeah, but
come at me, New Yorkers, come at me, Yankees.
All joking aside, we all do have a pretty broad perspective because we've lived in so many places. Joni's coming from Florida to Texas, and I've lived in Georgia, Mississippi, Iowa, Georgia, Mississippi, Missouri, and now Wyoming. I've lived in 5 states. So.
Okay, so you created Ask an Entomologist, which is a website, or I mean, it's kind of a brand, really. It trends
platform.
Thank you.
Platform.
Because you're on Facebook and brand. Twitter, and you have an email.
Yep, Facebook, right? Twitter, email.
Okay.
So.
But the idea is you can directly interact with an entomologist.
Yeah.
Why did you create it? Like you're in grad school, you're swamped with writing your thesis, you're trying to finish your master's, you're doing your research. Like, what was the critical point where you and Nancy sat down and you thought, what we need to do is create more work for ourselves?
Yeah.
So what was that?
Yeah, I find the last way that you asked it pretty funny. But as I said earlier, this happened after I was at after I left the USDA,
okay.
And a lot of the people one of the people who I worked with pretty closely there seemed to very much kind of look down on the idea of outreach, and a lot of the people who were doing outreach in the sort of social group that I had at the time very much seemed to sort of look down on people who had sort of lower level questions about stuff like that, or misconceptions about very basic things. And I was just more curious as to, if I put myself out there and, had this thing, what sort of questions would I receive? What sort of things were people curious about? How do they look at insects? What are they seeing when they look at them? That sort of thing. Because it is impossible for me to look at a bug through a non-entomologist's eyes. That is categorically impossible. That's something that I can't do. That's something that nobody in our community can do, by definition. So I really wanted to sort of see if I couldn't figure out a way to describe the world that we don't experience. And it's been very successful so far.
Yeah, just when you look at the number of submissions that you guys have, it's overwhelming.
Yeah, it is. It is very overwhelming, especially as the site's sort of grown, as we've gotten a lot more recognition, and as I've said, we could sit there and answer questions for 8 hours a day, especially during the summer, and it would we would probably not reach the end of our inbox anytime soon.
Yeah, as an extension entomologist, somebody whose job it is to answer, questions about insects, and not just insects, but that is a part of my job. It is very interesting how many people are encountering insects every day, and when they see either a behavior or an insect that they've never encountered before, they really do notice, they pay attention, and they're curious about it. I think a lot of people, they go through their day-to-day lives kind of not paying attention to stuff, but there are definitely a lot of people that are actively noticing things.
Yeah.
And when they do, they do run into that point where they're like, their knowledge hits a wall, and so having a resource where they can kind of reach out and get an answer, which may seem very basic for somebody who has a degree in biology or entomology specifically, that's a very valuable resource.
But I think that there's also an interactional sort of component to consider, because I've spent a lot of time, pushing back against what most people would call pseudoscience on the internet. Things like anti-vaccination, anti-GMO stuff, and in every case that I've seen, everything that I've dealt with, one of the main tactics that people use is to dehumanize scientists. So we actually sort of figure out a way to get people to connect with scientists and ask them questions, and build that trust. I think that's what I was going for, and it's sort of notable that pretty much all I hear from my colleagues is that you can't be trusted if you work for industry, or if you have any sort of industry connection, people will ignore you. And that's not true. I've been doing this for 5 or 6 years now, and I've been able to build a huge amount of trust with the public. I don't want to say despite working for industry, but I do work for industry. It has not been an issue, and I don't really get why people say stuff like that, because that's never been my experience.
Well, and honestly, there are a lot of people who have a similar bias against academia for reasons, so I don't know that it's just industry specific, but it's really amazing, the sort of the trust that you can build through the vulnerability of just letting yourself be accessible to people, right? That we don't keep ourselves behind some sort of wall or like, oh, you should read my paper. Like, I love that you guys are just there to answer people's questions. Yeah.
Yeah, and we're pretty dedicated to it. So
Yeah, it's fabulous. I mean, and for me, coming from an extension background, where my job is to be a face for research-based education, and information. Um, it's fabulous seeing you guys doing that from a grassroots. We saw a need, we decided to jump on it kind of position.
yeah.
Where I mean, extension is a whole industry in the United States, and that's our job. But you
Hmm.
guys, you were in a position where you were like, this niche of this service is not being met. We're gonna
Yeah.
do it.
Well,
And
I feel like a lot of extension programs don't take full advantage of the internet.
Mhm.
I mean, you're kind of laughing.
No, I'm very much laughing. Yeah, no, yeah, um, yeah, you're very right. Extension is very good at um, having research based information, but most of the people that I interact with in extension have a background in research, not
Hmm.
in education. And so we are very much behind the times in terms of how to educate. And one of those big components that we have been failing at as a community for the past 25 years is internet.
Yeah.
There are some. I mean, extension is to go off on my own personal rant. Extension is formulated differently in every single state in
Mm-hmm.
the United States.
Hmm.
And so some states have really great online programs, and some states have really terrible online programs. Most of them have really terrible online programs. And yeah, a big, huge part of that is we're not doing a good job of providing educational resources online,
Yeah.
and which has forced people like you to step up and provide answers to people that want answers.
He's
I
filling a
feel
niche.
well, here's the
Absolutely.
thing. I feel like that's part of it. I don't feel like I would say that there's not a lot of research or not a lot of information online for extension because a lot of the blog posts that we do use extension sources. In fact, Jody Green, who we're going to be playing D&D with here in a few weeks, has done a
Hmm.
fantastic job of updating her
Fabulous.
online universities, fact sheets and stuff like that. And that information is important. But what I really feel like we're missing from a lot of institutions is the sort of content that the Sue the T-Rex provides for the American Museum of Natural History,
Oh, you mean for
and
the Field
what,
Museum? But yes.
or for the Field Museum, sorry,
Sorry,
and what the
hometown museum.
Monterey Bay Aquarium
Oh my
does.
gosh.
I feel like we need, I feel like we need those sorts of I feel like we need those sorts of experiences for people for entomology and weed sciences. Uh, there's Andrew Kniss, Lynn Sosnowski, and a few others are doing fantastic work. But I go to conferences that are just about weed science that have just as many people as actually no, the Western Weed Science meeting that I went to had more people than some of the regional ESA meetings that I've been at.
Wow.
So we have this. So with weed science, we have this community that's almost as large as entomology, but I can only count 4 or 5 people with followings that approximate the number of um, followers that like entomologists have on Twitter. In fact, the professor just down the hall from my office, well-known guy, very highly respected. He's in charge of extension, and He does a fantastic job of it. 50 Twitter followers.
Yeah.
And he's one of the funniest people I know, and I feel like he could be excellent at this. So it's extension offices have a lot of great information, but I don't feel like they put it out there in the most entertaining way. And there's entire disciplines that have that problem. The discipline that I'm in now, weed science, I feel is sort of a textbook for that, because I can go out there and find all sorts of entomologists, on there having conversations about what they do, and just sort of being hilarious and funny and all that. I'm having a pretty hard time finding weed scientists to follow on social media. I mean, it's just what it is.
Yeah, I agree. You're right. I mean, Andrew Kniss and Lynn Sosnowski. Sosnowski?
I say Sosnowski. I am going to listen very closely to her name when I meet her at our conference.
They're both fabulous human beings, and they represent weed science, right? Whereas entomology is very well represented in social media. And I think you're absolutely right, Joe. When you do look at representation on social media, which is how a lot of people are interacting with scientists these days, entomologists are very well represented. There's a lot of us talking about very different stuff. If you want to find agricultural entomologists doing pest management stuff, you've got Dalton Ludwig, you've got myself. If you want to find people doing really very niche taxonomy, you've got Derek Hennon doing millipede stuff. You've got Miles Zhang doing wasp taxonomy. You're absolutely right. Entomology is well represented.
Well, not only are we well represented, we're also as a community very good at outreach. I don't see too many entomologists sort of screaming at each other, or like spending most of their days screaming at random activists online. When we talk to the public, we talk to the public and not at them. And I think that is something that is sort of ingrained in the entomology culture. It's something that's really, truly special. So I'm giving this talk about outreach at ESA this year, and it is one of the hardest talks that I've ever written, because they want me to come on and talk about outreach, but there are so many people in this community that are really, really good at outreach that what am I going to add to that conversation that nobody else is saying?
Well,
it's a legitimate question.
I know what my vote would be, or at least a good starting point. So I love when people start talking about this stuff, because there's a huge difference between outreach and engagement. And I think that you've sort of been talking around the idea, right? Talking at people and even talking to people is what we would call outreach. But when you're talking with people and engaging them and bringing them along with you in the process, and they're engaged in the information, they're much more likely to retain it, and they're much more likely to respond positively than if they're being talked at or lectured to or whatever. So that's my little banner that I like to unfurl, is this idea that we need to be engaging with people. And I know that sounds funny. I had a hard time with this at first when I switched from doing environmental education, face-to-face with people every day, to doing it on YouTube. And I was like, how am I going to engage? But I think it's really about, like you guys do with the answering questions, or I talk to people in the comments, right? Like, engagement is where we really find our value.
And people have to want to interact
right.
with you. That's the thing.
Yeah.
People have to want to talk to you,
right?
Because if they don't like you, it's you're not going to get very far.
Yeah, screaming into the void does very little.
Yeah. Or even worse, the void sometimes screams back.
That too.
That's even worse.
So, Joe, why did you make the transition from the wonderful, welcoming SciComm community of entomology into the void that is weed science?
He's just not letting
And
this go.
no, I want
He
to
is
know. I
not.
want
He
to
is
know
not. And
what motivated you to make that switch.
You know Cedric?
I
He just
almost
called you Cedric.
called
when Peter's especially annoying, he becomes Cedric.
Well, he does sound very much like his character right now. So
That's just my shitty character voice. I'm sorry. Nobody else has a
Oh,
character
no, I love
voice.
you.
I'm trying.
Excuse me. Excuse me. No
Yeah.
one
Alright,
else has a
fine.
character voice.
The DM is nailing it.
Yeah. So I've always really liked the problems that come around with agriculture. So we just have a lot of really weird problems, and agriculture is actually a really good model for evolution. So when I was looking for PhD programs around this time, I had a list of people who I wanted to work with, and some of them it was because of their research, some of them it was because of the outreach, and I finally accepted an offer from Andrew Kniss, who is a very well-respected weed scientist here in Wyoming. And the project that I'm working on is, to me, it's very interesting. So we don't really understand why weeds hurt crops, and so what we've so we understand certain parts of it. You know, we know that there's competition going on. We know that there's shade blooms. We know that they steal nutrients, you know, stuff like that. But at the end of the day, you know, if you look at like cornfields, for instance, we can water them to our heart's content, and we can put so much fertilizer on them that it creates a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, and those crops will not recover from weed damage. Like we can use literally environmentally apocalyptic methods to try to rescue them. Does not happen. So essentially what we've discovered in our lab is that at least in sugar beets, up to 70% of yield loss can be explained by shade avoidance. So we did a series of experiments in the field this summer where we forced beets and grass to compete with one another by while drawing nutrients from different soil pools. So we literally just put a wall between them. And Cheryl, I can send you pictures of this if you want to edit them in. And if you don't, you know, you can just cut that out.
So, all right, I gotta interrupt you here. Okay, first
yeah.
of all, for our listeners, can you explain what sugar beets are?
Yeah, so that's actually a good question. I should have explained that a bit further. So,
thanks, I'm a good interviewer.
60%... Hey, you know what? I am a bad interviewee, so we're good.
No, you're fantastic. You're fantastic. No.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Probably about 60 to 70% of our sugar comes from sugar cane, and that's grown in tropical regions. Another 30% or so actually comes from beets. And these are sort of like the red ones that you buy at the grocery store, the ones that are red and have a wonderful earthy cumin flavor that goes great with some.
I don't buy them at the grocery store because they taste like dirt, but go ahead.
Hey, you know what? Cumin, earth, very similar flavors. And I guarantee you that I could cook you a beet meal that you would love.
Bring it on. Bring it on.
Challenge.
Yeah. So sugar beets are they are actually the same species, those beets you buy from the grocery store, Beta vulgaris. But they've been bred to just essentially just shove as much sugar into the roots as they can. So they're like something like 30% sugar, I think, by weight, which is pretty similar to sugar cane.
Wow. And what do they look like?
They are these big white football-sized beets. So imagine like the beets that you get at a grocery store, and like football size or bigger.
Wow.
I've seen some that were nearly a foot across. So,
And
but
they're white rather than the red color we normally think of with beets. Wow.
Yep.
Huh.
Yep. And so the thing about sugar beets, though, is that, or the interesting thing about sugar beets is that every single response they have to weed competition is just maladaptive. There is no possible way that you could argue that any response that they have increases their competitive ability in any way, shape, or form. So
Okay,
these are just
so these things they're growing underground, right? Like the beet is a root, right? It's this big thick
it's a
root
tap
underground.
root.
This big this big football shaped root underground, and then above
Yep.
ground is these kind of like piece of paper sized green leaves, right? That are sticking up.
Yeah, so actually, like about the size of a printer sheet of paper, the bigger ones. But
Okay.
have you ever seen a Swiss chard?
Yes, I have.
Again, Beta vulgaris, and the leaves of sugar beets look a little bit like that.
Wait, hold
So,
up. Are you saying they're the same species?
Yep.
So, okay, all right. So most of our listeners might not know this, but yeah. So okay, so Swiss chard is
Is this
the
like the
same
broccoli
species.
thing?
It is
Yes.
exactly like the broccoli thing. So they've bred these things for completely different characteristics. So I was actually going to sort of go through the evolutionary history. So Beta maritimus is the sort of ancestral species of beets. It's this plant that grows on rocky shores near the ocean. It's very salt tolerant, and sugar beets have not been around for a very long time. I'd have to double check the book, but I want to say that they came about in like the 1870s.
All right. So
And they
post
were
Civil War.
what?
Post Civil War. For
Post
those
Civil
of us
War,
who are
but over in
from the
Europe.
South and use that as a metric for history. Sorry.
Yeah.
I don't think you have to be from the
So,
south to use that as a metric of time.
All right. Fair enough.
I try to avoid that metric because it can get real controversial real fast. So, anyways, these were actually bred from those red beets, which are turntable beets, and used for sugar production. So, the interesting thing to me about this experiment is that the non-resource competition thing, just growing plants around the beets without exposing them to the roots, like at all, reduces yield by 70%. And the reason that is because these plants reflect light onto the beet that tells the beet that there's other plants nearby. And what most other plants do is they respond by growing up much taller. They sort of respond by investing more energy into stem elongation. And what our research has shown is that so a full-grown beet can have up to 75 leaves. We've counted numbers as high as 50 to 75. Actually, you know what? I have some of my data here. So it's not uncommon for them to get, upwards of like 40, 50 leaves.
Okay.
70 might be a little bit unusual, but we've counted as high as 90 in our field work. So this response, the one that causes, up to 3/4 of the yield, or up to 70% of the yield loss, it gets fixed when the beets just have 2 leaves. So it gets fixed really, really early, and even if you remove the weeds, the plant never recovers. So, and what?
So when the beet first sprouts, it has a couple of leaves.
Yeah.
And if the color of the light around that freshly sprouted beet is affected by having other plants nearby, like weeds, then it doesn't grow as well. That's what you're saying.
Yeah, it grows to half the size or less.
Whoa.
And
That's
if
a
you,
huge difference.
yeah, it's a huge difference. And if it was really a competition thing, like most sources think it was, we would, you know, we wouldn't see that if it was mostly competition. So,
So when you say
um,
competition, you're talking about the weed and the beet are growing at the same time, and there's only so much nutrients in the soil, and they're
yeah,
just kind of seeing who can get there first and kind of
yeah,
fighting
they're
over it.
sort of slugging it out over nitrogen and, all those sort of nice trace elements. But
Right.
we also sort of know that this damage occurs to like before the weeds are big enough to compete. So that sort of makes sense from an ecological point of view. But to go back to Beta maritimus, what really interests me about this is, why does this plant have this response that's completely maladaptive? Because even though these plants sort of grow on rocky shores where not a whole lot of other things grow, I would imagine that there's probably green algae that grows, near them
Mm-hmm.
and would cause the same thing. So it
Mm.
doesn't really make sense to me that this response is so maladaptive. So going on to one of my projects, there's some other interesting observations that have been made about this. So ideally, what we'd like to do is we'd like to be able to, just say spray a chemical onto the plants along with an herbicide to make sure that, they grow up big and strong, right?
Sure.
That
Right.
would
How do
be
you fix this problem?
Well, that's where we're sort of running into trouble because a lot of the literature on shade avoidance seems, we have so much literature on like how the pathway works, but if you were to read a lot of these review papers on, like phytochromes, for instance, you would think that the process is reversible, and it doesn't seem to be. And
So a small beet that it has only two leaves, if it gets stunted in this way, it's stunted for its entire life. It doesn't
yeah,
matter
there's
whether it
nothing we
grows
can do to
40
reverse it.
leaves or 90 leaves.
Yeah.
Wow.
Hmm.
Okay.
But the thing is, the molecules that sense these actually sort of reverse over time. So this is obviously a very fixed developmental program that gets um, more fixed as time goes on, it looks like. And there's a lot of questions why about that. But what's really interesting to me is that so hailstorms in Wyoming go together like peanut butter and jelly. Like we had a hailstorm earlier this year that hit this study pretty hard, and we lost maybe a dozen plants.
It was during a nature check game.
It was, and you guys heard me curse about
Yep.
that. So that
I
hailstorm,
remember that.
that hailstorm wiped out about a dozen plants. And all of the ones that were in that shade avoidance treatment, where we had put the grass in and then removed it, they all grew back
Huh.
as shade avoidance plants. So a lot of the literature that you'll read on this topic, implies that the leaves control this pathway and makes it seem reversible. Well, it's not reversible, and you can mow the top off of a beet, and it will still retain this developmental program, at least as far as we can tell from hailstorms, which are sort of a natural experiment.
Mm-hmm.
So where I'm sort of going with this, with my beet research, is I want to make some Franken beets. So what I want to do is I want to be able to get them specced into that shade avoidance pathway, cut off get a plant specced into that shade avoidance pathway, cut off the top of the beet, and then transplant it to the root of a beet that has never seen another plant,
Huh.
and switch the tops and the bottoms to see which one recovers and which one gets stunted.
So you're looking to see whether the trigger for this uh, uh, weed response behavior is in the top of the plant or in the root.
I want to see if it's the leaves or the roots which drive this process, because I think it's the roots. And there's
Mm.
there's actually some papers from like 50 years ago which were doing grafting experiments with chard, which has bigger leaves than sugar beets, and table beets. And the root properties didn't really seem to change all that much when you put different tops on them. So I'd like to do this line of research that hasn't been touched since essentially since my parents have been alive.
Wow.
Wow. That's really cool.
Very.
Yep.
Very. Whew. Well, yeah, we've been, yeah, I was going to say, that is a really awesome sort of like look into how we come up with research questions, which I think is really fun. Thank you so much, Joe, for telling us a bit about your background with outreach and education through Ask an Entomologist, and thank you for sharing some of your preliminary PhD investigations. This was super cool.
Well, the experiments have to start working first.
Yeah. That's why I said preliminary. Do you guys have any sort of final thoughts for the end of this nature chat?
No, this was fantastic. Thank you, Joe, for giving us more of a
Joe.
deep dive into your research. It sounds really interesting. I look forward to hearing more about it.
Yeah, definitely.
And
I guess during this last episode, we decided to sort of go out with random bits of grad student advice, and the piece of advice for this week is to be human. It's fine to go out to a restaurant or take the weekend off, or go out on a date.
Please take all the weekends off if you can.
Yes,
it's good for your brain. You'll be a better researcher if you take the weekends off.
Yep. You are not your research. You are a human being completely distinct from your job.
Yes.
And you should treat yourself like that.
Yep. And if you take the weekends off, then you have time to watch Nature Check. So there's always that. So thanks to everybody for tuning in. Thank you to Peter and Joe for hanging out and talking on this Nature Chat. And find us again next Saturday for another From the Annals of History episode, where the two of these guys, along with a few other people, will be exploring some plot lines that happened before the main storyline of Nature Check. So we'll see you guys later.